Hello, welcome back to Seaport Vault. My name is Sarah Augustine, and today we are talking about how the Philadelphia waterfront has evolved over time. Would you believe that right where I'm walking right now, if not too long ago in the past, we would have had to have been on a boat in order to be walking. Otherwise, we would have been swimming. So with that, let's go look for where the waterfront used to be.
Hey Sarah, do you know why the boat at the bottom of the ocean is shaking so much? Because it's a nervous wreck. Get it? A nervous wreck?
That was a long journey, wasn't it? So, the waterfront used to be right where Delaware Avenue is today. And down here in this section, it's Columbus Boulevard, but then it was all Delaware Avenue. So if we look right over here, over my right shoulder, we see that roadway? That used to be the water's edge. Now, all that in mind, let's head inside and start learning about what the waterfront has evolved over time. All right, we don't need this anymore, do we? So let's start off this video by talking about what the waterfront would have looked like before this was Philadelphia, before Pennsylvania was even Pennsylvania. So in its very, very earliest form, kind of post everything just being wild, no humans around, the Native Americans had really kind of crafted and curated this landscape to meet their own personal needs. So it would have been a very steep natural bank and some streams punctuating that high bank, but otherwise relatively untouched other than making accommodations for living and hunting and things like that. So when William Penn did eventually arrive, that landscape was modified even further to meet those needs that were kind of like a European ideal. So we went from the very natural to more of the grid-like that we think of Philadelphia today. So Penn's surveyors laid everything out perfectly and all the streets were established. And with that, Penn started to realize that all of those piers, all of those kind of water access points would have been kind of roped off as private property, kind of in that gridded out early stage. So he made sure to make accommodations for some public piers. And since the banks were still at that point very steep, he had some steps that would lead down, and there are actually some of those steps still intact in Philadelphia, near Water Street. So that was really colonial America, but as we got into the 1800s and the mid-1800s, things just grew more and more industrialized, and as we modify for human needs, we had to make accommodations for all of that industrialization. So with that, the waterfront evolved even further. Streams were covered up and put into pipes, bridges were built, piers were extended and actually built out into the river, and the whole landscape really, really starkly evolved. So let's move a little bit further down in the exhibit to look into that a little bit further. So the Philadelphia waterfront was, and still is really, truly crafted and curated to meet the needs of a booming industrial port. You could say that Philadelphia's piers are important. I'll stop. How about that? All right, so anyway, all of these piers were built out kind of in alignment with the streets of Philadelphia. So if you were to look at a map, and we will in just a moment, you would see that they're kind of like fingers that just jut out in direct alignment with the streets into the Delaware River. And they're kind of like parking bays, if you can think about it that way maybe. So you come in, you're in your ship, you pull in to the river, and then this is the dock you want to go into, so you just pull right in, and then the pier is right there, and that's how they load and unload all of those cargo ships. So Philadelphia was a booming, booming center of trade for both coastal United States as well as international trade, specifically with China. So with that, this was really kind of the place to be. There was a lot of activity happening, and it was just kind of a really bustling area. So Delaware Avenue looked a lot different than it does right now. Right now, it's pretty much just a road with a bunch of big buildings alongside of it. But then it was a dirt road with a lot of carriages. There were a lot of kind of industrial things happening. There were different storefronts, a lot of ship suppliers. that were on the riverfront, because that is really what it was all about. It was all about that port of trade. In addition to all of those municipal piers that William Penn had kind of established, there were also several, and pretty much most of them, that were owned by private companies. So Reading Railroad specifically had a big chunk of land that was up around where Port Richmond is today. So those were all of their ferry terminals for where the trains would come in. They could either unload cargo or they could unload people to put them over to New Jersey, because at that point there were still no bridges. So just as our modern roadways need regular maintenance, so do our waterways. Now, to make way for all of those ships that were really, really wide and really, really deep, the waterway had to be regularly dredged to about 45 feet, and it still is today. So that is something that was originally left up to the private dock owners, because they're the ones who had to have their ships come in, and it was just kind of like shoveling out your own parking space in a way. But in the 1850s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers assumed that responsibility, and today they still maintain that channel out there to a depth of about 45 feet. So, all of this in mind, let's head into the research center to kind of visualize what these piers would have looked like and what the waterfront looked like then. All right, so here I have an atlas of Philadelphia from 1877, and it's actually one of our new acquisitions to the research center. So inside of this atlas, and I mean 1877 is really showing us kind of post-peak of that really, really bustling port of Philadelphia. So we're still seeing kind of a snapshot of what it really looked like when all of the changes had already been made and when the piers were still really, really functioning at their height. So on this page over here, we see all of those little fingers pulling out into the Delaware River, and those are the piers of Philadelphia. And with this, you can really see that they're in alignment with that grid-like street pattern that William Penn was so insistent upon having. And it's really this really neat kind of parking lot effect that you get with the port. And we also have a close-up view of the 2nd through 18th wards of Philadelphia. And we can see kind of really close up how those ferry patterns would have looked and where the docks were, what they were maybe doing, and then also what streets and neighborhood they lined up with. So we also see how the railroads were in alignment with these different piers, and not every pier had a railroad coming up to it, but the ones for Pennsylvania Railroad obviously did because they're owned by the railroad, but we had to get those goods to and from the port somehow, and the railroad really was that somehow. So all the goods would come into Philadelphia, board the ships from those piers, and then make their way to whatever part of the country or the world they had to go to. And it was the same in reverse for goods coming in, all those import goods. So we can notice on this atlas that there are no bridges laid out. We're just seeing those little ferry tracks. And that's because at this point, there were still no bridges. So with that, let's head back into At the Water's Edge to explore how Philadelphia's iconic bridges came to be. So before there were any bridges that were crossing the Delaware River here in Philadelphia, we used ferries to get across. Now the ferries at one point were steam operated, but before that they were actually rowed by actual human beings. Can you believe that? That's a lot of work. So with the ferry boats, there were also some kind of like taxi services or Uber services that were little smaller rowboats that you could just rent out and you could go over to Camden or come back from Camden to Philadelphia. And that was really how you crossed the river. That was the only way to cross the river until 1922 when the Ben Franklin Bridge was erected. So before we knew of it as the Ben Franklin Bridge, it was actually the Delaware River Bridge because it was the bridge that went over the Delaware River. The invention of cars really drove the building of the Ben Franklin Bridge, and I do mean pun intended, of course. So with the Ben Franklin Bridge, we have the opportunity for vehicular traffic, we have carriages still using it, and we also have train and pedestrian services. So it was originally for commuters and also the transportation of goods in addition to the transportation of people. And it was later joined in 1929 by the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge, which is a drawbridge. So the Ben Franklin Bridge, as you can see over my shoulder, is a little bit higher, and that was intentional. It was to allow all of those big ships that were still using the Delaware River, and still do use the Delaware River, to get up and down with ease. Later additions included the Commodore Barry Bridge, the Delaware Memorial Bridge, and the Betsy Ross Bridge in 1976. Bridges and piers aren't the only thing that have kind of evolved in Philadelphia over the years. We also had islands at one point. Yes, you heard me right, islands. Let's go check it out. So when we look out of the window today from the museum, we just see river and then we see Camden. But a little over 100 years ago, we would have seen an island amidst that view. We would have actually seen two islands, but originally it was just one. We'll get to that in just a second. So from our modern eyes, it's kind of hard to think about there being a big island in the middle of the Delaware River right here, but that also would have been hard for William Penn to imagine with his colonial eyes. And that is because they simply were not here when William Penn arrived. And we know this not because we're time travelers, which I am, don't tell anybody, but because in the early surveyors' maps, there were just no land masses or islands in the middle of the river right in this area. But eventually they just kind of appeared, and with that we can make note that they were there at that point. So the islands, which were just one island again, started out as a shoal in the river, which is a buildup of silt, that eventually evolved into a naturally forming island. Now with that, the ferry traffic kind of had to just go around that island, and that takes up a lot of time, especially when you're trying to do direct commuting routes. So they decided to split that island in two, creating Smith and Windmill Islands. They were a site of recreation and they were functioning islands. They weren't just land masses that were doing nothing in the middle of the river. But they were land masses that were clogging up traffic. Now, with the bustling port of Philadelphia, we had to sometimes use our river as a parking lot for ships. So while those big ships were waiting for the piers to open up, they would have to just kind of float out there in the Delaware River, and they would just park out there. And those islands were taking up valuable parking space. So in the late 1800s, everybody decided, well, we don't really need them. Why are they here? Let's dredge them out. So dredge them out they did indeed. They scooped out all of that dirt, all of that island to create just river. And all of that dirt was moved down to where League Island is. And the islands were no more. All right, so that about wraps it up for today's video, but let's take a pause to think about the Philadelphia waterfront of today. So the Independent Seaport Museum is located on Penn's Landing in Philadelphia. Now Penn's Landing was not a thing until the 1970s. It's actually filled in portions of those piers that we've been talking about all day today that were built out in the 1970s and coincided with things like the bicentennial and the creation of I-95. So, while it looks a lot different than it did 100 years ago, Philadelphia's waterfront is still a vibrant part of our community. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, I'm gonna row along.